My name is Stephen Laurie. I'm a project manager at the ROM, and I thank you for joining us here today for our ROM Connects program. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the ROM sits on the ancestral lands of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Anishinaabeg Nation, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation since immemorial to today. I'm delighted you could join us today for today's ROM Connects program in support of the recently opened 2002 edition of the Wildlife Photographer of the Year exhibition on until April 23rd of 2023, and is developed and produced by the Natural History Museum, London. And I would like to take the opportunity to thank the Royal Exhibitions Circle for their support of the exhibition. Wildlife Photographer of the Year is the longest running and most prestigious annual nature photography competition in the world. And it recognizes the world's best nature photography and has been so ever since 1965. The competition uses photography to celebrate the wonderful diversity of life, to inspire and inform, and to create advocates for the planet. It champions ethical photography, rewarding truthful representations of nature that display respect for animals, the environment, and calls attention to the beauty and fragility of the world. It also makes connections with our own experiences, as well as the resilience of creative spirit of photographers and artists in the face of ever-changing dynamics between nature, humans, and societies. I've had the opportunity as project manager to realize the ROM's Wildlife Photographer of the Year exhibition for over 10 years, and during which time I've been able to connect with wildlife photographers around the world and hear directly from them their admiration for wildlife and their work collectively, and their work and how it collectively impacts the way we interact with our environments. Today's conversation brings together a diverse group of photographers working in the field of wildlife photography to share their experiences. We'll begin with a short film created to highlight the work of Audun Rikardsen, and a WPY competition regular who has been appointed, who was appointed to jury for this year's competition. I'll then ask my guests to join me on screen to share their thoughts on wildlife photography as a discipline and how they approach their work. We hope you enjoy the film.
Litt høyre! Høyre! Kort høyre! Kort høyre! Merkesett! Yes! I'm Audun Rikardsen. I'm a professor in biology at the UiT, the Arctic University of Norway, up in northern Norway in Tromsø. But I'm also a nature photographer. My science is based up on whale science lately, but also I've been working on fish science. And my photography often go hand in hand on what I do in my science. One of my things that I really like to do is to take so-called split pictures where you have, or half and half, where you can see like half of the image is below the surface and the rest is above the surface. And it really fascinates me because you have this thin little millimeter that divides two totally different worlds, above water and below water. And if I'm able to capture a story which is shown in above water and connected to the story behind the water, that's what I wanted to show in my picture. I think that goes back to my childhood. I remember I got a diving mask from my parents, and I went down in the tidal zone to test it. It was really cold, and I remember I was freezing. But that first impression I had still stays with me. When I put on the mask, I can hear all the birds, the cars driving by, the waves and everything. And then I took on the mask and put my head underwater, and it was totally different. You can see all these animals, and it was kind of quiet. And then when I moved my head up and down, I had both these worlds, you know, in a fraction of a second. Oi! Fantastisk fascinerende. Like nerd. I have been interested in nature all from I was a child, and also did some photography when I was a teenager. But I started up more or less professionally I bought my first camera in 2009. And since then I submitted to quite a few competitions, but the main competition above all is the Wildlife Photographer of the Year. The Wildlife Photographer of the Year is definitely the most prestigious competition in nature photography in the world. It's regarded as the Oscar award ceremony for nature photographers. And since I first submitted in 2014 and was awarded, I have had quite a few pictures awarded in the Wildlife Photographer of the Year competition. This year I was asked to be in the jury, which was really a big honor for me, and it was extremely interesting to see everything from the other side. And you can see there was 50,000 pictures submitted, and there was weeks of work, but it was a really interesting job, particularly discussing with other jury members and making compromises, discussing what makes this picture much better than other pictures, and so on. Being the largest competition, a nature competition, it also has a very important role of creating awareness and around nature, the value of having a sustainable nature, and also related to management and conservation of nature. This picture was taken when I was on a research cruise with the Norwegian Coast Guard that often control the boats and check if everything is going after the rules. I was there on the boat to satellite tag killer whales as for my research, because the killer whales are usually aggregating around the fishing boats to feed on herring that's drifting around, like for a free meal. And then one morning we saw this happening, and it was fishing boats that have probably been too ambitious, and it took too much herring in the net, with the results that the net broke, and several thousands of kilos of herring, dead or half dead herring, was drifting around and got lost. Instead of standing there with my gun to tag the killer whales, I took up my camera and I tried to document this in the best way, in also to showing the masses of herring that was drifting, because this is half dead, and this is only a fraction of the herring, because most of the herring will sink. And in fact, this picture was used as proof in a court. So I was not allowed to publish this picture after that court was settled. So this is helping to put focus on similar cases of overfishing. A nice photo of, well, if it was whales or other animals, can say something what we could potentially lose. A not so nice or horrifying photo can have another impact. It hits you emotionally, and that probably puts more awareness of what we are doing to nature. I think it's important to also show these kind of pictures. You will get a bad feeling, but those pictures are the pictures that probably also can contribute most to change, and the change in opinion when it comes to management, conservation and political processes. When I started taking pictures, I was more into getting a nice picture of an animal. That has changed, and it has also changed when I started to submit it to this competition, because now I feel if I'm going to submit a picture, it has to tell a story. it has to show something that get people curious what is happening in the picture. I also plan my pictures in a way, in the same way as I plan my research projects. So you think through it, you have the knowledge behind it, and you think, what do you want your picture to show? How can I show the story that I want to tell in one single picture, or maybe a series of pictures? And I think if you have those thoughts behind it before you take the picture, you will also get a better picture.
Go! Yes!
Okay, so I want to take some time to welcome our today's panelists. As was in the video, we had Audun Rikardsen as a unique combination. He's a professor of biology and an internationally awarded nature photographer. His photographs have been awarded in the Wildlife Photographer of the Year contest 13 times, including 2 firsts. He has also been awarded a Norwegian Award for Excellence in Communication of Science. He served on the jury for the 2022-23 Wildlife Photographer of the Year competition. We're also joined by Abdulla Moussa, is a wildlife conservation photographer based out of the majestic Canadian Rockies. He enjoys spending as much time as possible outdoors and always walks away with a sense of gratitude and inspiration from his experiences in nature. Abdulla's images attempt to convey the wild spirit of these magnificent creatures in their own natural environments, doing so in an ethical manner that minimizes disturbances. All of Abdulla's images are of wildlife animals and are created without the use of baiting or calling, and his work has been featured in various outlets, including Canadian Geographic, both online and in print. We have Daniela Rupolo, who is a video producer at the ROM with a passion for nature and wildlife. She's been shooting and editing since her days as the only female in her high school media club. She began her career with the CBC Toronto, but her love for long-form storytelling and conservation led her to the ROM. Over the past few years, she's worked on with various scientists across the country to tell stories of blood-sucking leeches, endangered whales, and extinctions from the dawn of early life. Just to give you a little bit of a heads up, I encourage you to submit your thoughts via the Q&A feature during the program, and we will be able to live answer those questions either throughout the conversation or most preferred at the end. So to sort of preface this panel discussion, some of the topics that we're going to attempt to cover today largely kind of center around why wildlife photography, communication and storytelling, wildlife photography and art, ethical photography, tips and tricks, and photography for the self and community. So I'm going to start off with the first question, and I'm going to just kind of open this up to our panelists. And it's a more general question: is why do you photograph wildlife, and what do you look for when taking photos or selecting photographs for a competition like Wildlife Photographer of the Year?
Okay, does that go to me or so? I can start.
Take it away, Audun. Yeah,
start
off.
I think my interest come from where I'm sitting now. I'm sitting at my home place. And I grew up in a small community, very close to nature, and my parents took me out quite often. I think my interest came from there in many regards. And also I was able to join a neighbor working with what you see here, eagles, that was tagging eagles. And by doing that, I came really close to the animals, and I felt being in the situation, and that's something that I think have followed me to my photography, taking pictures like this, often with camera traps, things like that. So you
you get the sense of being in the situation. Rather use a wide angle lens than telelenses. My photography goals have been going wider and wider, you can say, in that regard. So I think that's comes all back from my childhood. Your other question is how do you pick a picture? Well, that's not often easy. You have to be very hard by yourself and ask yourself a few times. I think one good idea is to check all the winning pictures of most competitions, try to figure out what makes them special. Try also to see what your own picture is. There anything that makes those pictures stands out? There's thousands and thousands of really good pictures, but there's often the little small details that brings it up from really good to extremely good. It just has an X factor, a little extra, and that's something you have to look for in your own pictures. And also, I think dare to be different. Not following the mainstream. If you want to have something that stands out, try to look for something different in your own pictures and plan, taking from different angles, different animals, and so on. I think that's because when you look as a jury, when you look through thousands and thousands of pictures, it's the one picture that like pops up that, oh, this is different, because there's so many good pictures, but what stands out and make that picture different from others is usually why you pick it. And something also, if you see this is more than you can see in the picture, it has some kind of story behind it, then it also lifts the picture.
That's great. Thanks, Audun. Abdulla, do you want to add to that, or do you want to kind of give us your sort of drive as to why you shoot photography, wildlife photography?
Yeah, of course. So yeah, I definitely echo a lot of what Audun said. For me, the driving factor really is just first and foremost, I would say a love for nature. I just love spending time outdoors, any chance that I get, and I live in the Rockies, so it's really easy to have access to really beautiful environments. So for me, it's really the process which I enjoy, just spending time in the backcountry and just hiking. And I also love telling the stories of the wildlife that I experience. So I look for images, and this is more towards your second question, but I look for images that tell a story and showcase a unique behavior. So something that showcases like the everyday life of the animal. This particular picture, for example, that's on screen, this is during the elk rut that happens every September into October. And it just happened to happen on the school ground. So you have all the students on their way in the morning to school, and they're just witnessing 2 young bull elks, and there was probably another 20 or 30 elk around them. And they're witnessing the young elk just kind of play fighting and practicing, which I thought was just really unique. That you have urban wildlife, just kind of taking over a local school ground, and just like how people and animals have gotten to coexist in this particular small town in the mountains. But that's what I really look for. It's just like unique behaviors, and the driving factor for me is really just enjoying the time that I spend outdoors and the solitude and the peace that I get from being outdoors. So just it makes me want to spend more time, even when I'm not successful, if you will, in finding anything.
So that's interesting. So you're also really focused in on the moment with you and the camera, not necessarily being a little bit, prescriptive or planning. You're sort of like following your internal compass and kind of exploring space with your camera and animals.
Absolutely, yes.
Daniela, let us know what gets you out there with the camera.
So yeah, I live in downtown Toronto, and up in a high rise, so there's not a ton of wildlife around me. I also don't own a car, so I'll take my bike out to different parks. Most of the wildlife I end up seeing is birds. This image is actually in Antigua, Guatemala. A lot of my photography happens when I'm traveling. And what sort of gets me. I've always loved traveling. I particularly, I only travel solo. And part of the reason I only travel solo is that in the past, I've been with people on trips, and like Abdulla was saying, you know, I'll sit there and spend, you know, however much time I feel like, you know, observing an animal or just watching a sunset. And a lot of people don't have the patience for that. So it became clear to me very early that if I want to, you know, shoot nature and be in nature and spend as much time as I want, it has to be alone. And that's, I prefer it that way. I've been shooting, you know, still since I was a kid, but professionally, of course, I mostly do video. And even I was out in the field in various UNESCO sites in 2021. And we were in this little tiny remote town in Newfoundland. And my coworker was concerned that if we didn't get back to the hotel in time, we would miss dinner. And I was like, listen, the sun is setting over these fossils. I'm not moving. I don't care if I miss dinner. And like, I'm a very food motivated person. So that was a big deal for me. But I didn't want to go. And we did end up getting back, and the chef had gone home. But because Newfoundlanders are lovely people, they called him back and he made us fish and chips. But yeah, for me, it's a lot like Abdulla said about just spending time outside, because unfortunately I don't get a lot of opportunity to do that in downtown Toronto.
Oh.
And this deer is from, actually, Audun inspired me to go to northern Norway. So this is a Sami reindeer that I just captured last month up near Tromsø.
This is really interesting
And that was
because
pretty
we're getting quite a range of different kinds of work and photography, and it's really interesting to see things through your lens. And then, you know, building off of what Audun was speaking in his video about storytelling, I'm curious, like we got a sense what Audun's talking about when he relates to storytelling with his images, but maybe, you know, Abdulla or Daniela, you might want to kind of expand on maybe some of those points. I feel that your work has a story behind it, and maybe explain what we'd hope that a visitor like that would visit our museum, if they seen your image, what would they hopefully get out of seeing your work? Maybe just to kind of expand on that narrative or story kind of quality in your work.
Just while this reindeer is up, a lot of the times, you know, I'll just go to where, you know, wildlife is, and then I'll sort of discover the story as I'm waiting. In this case, it was a Sami reindeer herding camp. And so, you know, we had the Sami are indigenous people from northern Norway and Finland and Russia, I believe. And so, you know, I was just there because obviously reindeer are magical and wonderful, and I wanted to spend time with them. But I ended up talking to one of the herders, and she was telling me how they're currently fighting because people are trying to purchase or take back, I guess, the land where most of their reindeer are herded to turn them into windmill farms. And so I sort of found out the story as I was there shooting the reindeer in this case.
Interesting story. Abdulla, did you want to add anything to the sort of the importance of storytelling within your work?
Yeah, so on my end, what one thing that comes to my mind when I'm trying to tell a story is to help someone first and foremost understand the species and their everyday life. So a lot of times I'll walk away from some images and it'll spark some conversations for people who may never have seen the different variations of colors, for example, that black bears can come in. So I'll get some people who'll tell me, oh, I didn't know that black bears can technically be blonde, or they could be cinnamon in color, or in some cases really light in color, almost white. So those pictures really helped kind of showcase the diversity that we have in Canada and in the Rockies, which sometimes people don't have access to. And then also one thing that I try to capture is just the harsh environment that the Canadian Rockies can be in, that can be, especially in winter, because a lot of times I find that we can kind of forget the challenges of being outdoors when it's really -30. So this coyote, for example, you know, if you look really closely, it's blind on one eye. Its right eye is blind, and then its left ear is missing a little bit of a chunk. So this is a coyote that I've seen over and over and over again, and I've just been so impressed by its ability to just survive really harsh conditions. You know, when I'm laying on the snow and taking a picture, I'm, you know, every part of my body is trying to get out of that environment. And then I turn around and I see a coyote that's just trekking through the snow like it's no big deal. Or a beaver that's in the water and I'm just dying. And you can see the animals, just their ability to just survive those harsh conditions. I'm always walking away impressed by that. So I try to capture that in my stories to help people understand like what goes on out there with wildlife.
No, that's very interesting because, like, I've been noticing with all three of you, there's not really a necessarily a linear sort of format to the narration that's similar to like text. It's visual language. When you're reading these images or the sequence of images that you create, it's through that process and over a duration of time. Even Audun's work, where like I've experienced his work probably on an annual basis, where I can see that kind of that desire to try to capture those moments and share those moments, build upon a body of work that is giving you a different vantage point. And I think that what's interesting is that's where it starts tipping into similar questions about like, how does wildlife, or how do you see wildlife photography kind of coming up against art? Do you see this as an art form, or do you see it as something else? Because it shares some of the similar couplings, like the idea of telling a story, notionally bringing something to awareness. It could be political, it could be just beautiful. Maybe we'll open up that question. And Audun, maybe you want to, you know, riff on that, the idea of wildlife photography, and how do you think it's accepted as art? You know, those I want to just kind of open that up a little bit.
Well, I think both yes and no. For me, it's definitely art. No doubt about that. There might be others that might not define it as that or something in between. But I see it as that, and I see a lot of the way you make the pictures. I think is similar if you paint a picture, or if you picture it. And again, art also is about feelings. It's about what you see in a picture. It's about sometimes thinking different, you know, sometimes show situations when you're starting to wonder, what is this? This is something I haven't seen. Things like that. So there's a lot of similarities between that, and to me, it's for me, it's often that you know, those moments like this one and others. Well, one thing for nature photography has sometimes been criticized because they show situations, or they give people expectations. When you see that picture in mine or Abdullah's or Daniela's, and you go out and you say, "Well, I don't see this. I don't see this." So you are being criticized because you don't show the natural situation that everyone sees. So that's my point. That's my point with going out there. I wanted to show those situations which you rarely see, to show those and show the uniqueness with it. So to me, it's all the way around, and of course then arts also come into that, and it's how you stage it, is how you get that, you know, line up nice. Sometimes you can break, you know, the common rules to get another perspective, but which also other kind of artists do. So yes, clearly, it's an art for me at least.
That's great. Daniela, did you want to riff off that, like just build on it, or have a different point of view?
I have a complicated relationship with the term artist. I have friends that tell me they think photos I take are art. I don't tend to agree with them. I think, you know, it's about, for me, it's always been about documentation and the experience of documenting something. I don't think I've ever planned a photo like Audun has. I do think obviously there's artistic aspects like composition. You know, when you're taking a photo you've shot and you crop it, you're making sort of an artistic call about which part of the frame you want to show. But for me, yeah, I mean, I think I definitely think some wildlife photography is art. Like those jellyfish under the northern lights photos that Audun takes, like stunning, definitely art. For me and my photography, not so much. I don't think I would refer to it as art. I would refer to it more as sort of a hobby that some people interpret as art.
That's interesting. Abdulla, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's very, as has been said, it's very subjective what art is. It really just depends on your view. I tend to think that yes, it is art. There's a lot of art involved in just using the camera to capture the best light. There are different settings that you have to master. On top of being able to find the animal, of course, which wildlife photography in some ways all about, because you're not guaranteed the sightings and you have to spend a lot of time to find subjects that obviously have to live their lives and they're moving about. So yeah, I view it as art. And I think it's, there's different artistic components involved in it, which is why I look at it that way, that, but I don't think that for it to be art, it has to be artificial in any way. So you don't have to kind of mess around with the post-production and change the image from what you actually saw. So I try to keep my images as much as possible reflecting what I viewed that day. But that can be really subjective because, as Danielle mentioned, second, you're cropping, you're changing things from what you necessarily saw that day. So there's a lot of opinions about what is acceptable or is not acceptable. I just think that, it's very personalized to whoever is taking the picture. But whether it's art or not, in my mind, I feel like it is art, but I feel like the art can be very reflective of what you actually saw that day. So I don't feel like I need to manipulate what I saw for it to be considered art.
Okay. It's interesting. There's a couple terms that came up in this conversation. And I like the idea that it could be elastic. It doesn't necessarily have to be camped in art. It could be camped in other forms of practice. But the idea of manipulation, the idea of sort of getting that shot, what it takes to get that shot, kind of comes closer to my next question. Is around sort of animal safety and sort of what they call ethical photography. So, within this idea of manipulation or adjustments, there's all these kind of technical parameters that both NHM and the Wildlife Photographer of the Year control heavily in terms of what you can do with the images when you put them in. That's one thing. But then there's actually getting the shot. There's in the field, you're getting yourself set up to do what you do. And, what's your ideas around sort of, animal safety, or at least sort of when you're a photographer, your awareness around even their environment, about how much you're getting involved with their environment comes into your thinking when you're doing photography, especially wildlife photography. And then once you answer that, I wouldn't mind just maybe giving one tip. Like if you were to give anybody a tip, like a student or an amateur photographer embarking upon the idea of wildlife photography, about picking up that camera, what would be one of those tips that you'd give to ensure that they're aware of what they're doing and making sure that they're kind of keeping their subjects safe? Because we all love animals and we want them to be around. We just don't want to be too invasive as human beings. So maybe open that up to maybe Daniela. Did you want to start on that?
Ooh. Yeah, I mean, it's my cheeky guanaco. So interestingly, this is shot in Torres del Paine, the national park in Chile and Patagonia. And it was actually the first time I had hired a guide, a local guide, specifically because I wanted to encounter pumas. Pumas are very well protected in this park. It's kind of their territory. They're the kings there. But I knew that, me just the first time in Chile, I have no real knowledge of this animal. And I didn't want to be interrupting any environments, trying to seek it out on my own. So I hired a guide, and we spent the whole day. We went out at 4 a.m. And he's lived there his whole life. He does this every day. He knows the patterns, and he specifically, when I was looking for a guide, I made sure that it was somebody who listed certain ethics on their website. The first time I went whale watching was in Victoria, BC, many years ago, and I remember some boats were getting so close, and our boat was like, you're not supposed to do that. Every now and then a research boat would go by, and I'd be like, well, how come they can get that close? And they would explain that it was a research boat. But with the puma specifically, it's also a wild animal, of course. Like, you come up against a cougar in the wild, your camera's not protecting you. So it was important to me to find people that ethically track the pumas, and that care about their conservation, and they know the names of every single puma that lives in the park. They know when the babies are born. In this case, this puma was named Blinka, and she had 2 cubs with her. We ended up seeing her sort of around 8 o'clock sunset. And I've actually kept in touch with that puma tracker, and he let me know a couple months ago that Blinka was injured. She was hunting a guanaco, and she hurt her back leg. And I've sort of been following up with him on the status of her and how she's doing. And for me, I think the reason a lot of people do wildlife photography is to have an emotional connection with the animal. This looks probably a lot closer than I was to the pumas. I had a telephoto lens. I was sort of behind a bush. And as cars were driving by, they also made a habit of making sure that we sort of stayed low to the ground, because a lot of sort of tour vans go through and they recognize his car. And so they'll see his car and they'll pull over, and like 30 people will get out and start looking for pumas. And it's obviously very disruptive. So yeah, for me, it's about not disturbing the animal. You don't want it to, I'm obviously making full eye contact with this cub, which was crazy. I think that's like, it's hard to describe the feeling of making eye contact with a puma cub, but I was far away, and they're very used to the presence of humans, and there's no real danger because there's so much prey for them. Like they feed on guanacos, and there's an abundance of them. So yeah, I just felt very lucky, and I'm glad that I hired an expert. And my tip, I guess, would be don't just go out into the wild and hope you're going to see this, or hope you're going to experience always a positive interaction, and respect boundaries, respect ecos. In Bolivia, I really wanted to shoot flamingos in the lagoons, and there was very clearly marked ecosystem boundaries, and a lot of influencers, and they were just walking right into the lagoons. They just did not care. And I would say very much avoid that, because especially if you're doing this because you love animals, your photo is not worth disrupting that animal's environment.
Right. Well, thank you, Danielle. It really kind of hits a number of points which are really valuable. And I think, Abdulla, like in my introduction to you, that touched on a couple of those points about creating a good, healthy relationship between you and the animal, meaning like space, using mechanisms allowed to kind of gap that space so that it feels like you're present, but also respectful of that animal. Maybe you want to expand a little bit more on if there's any possibility from your point of view.
Yeah, of course. So I definitely agree with Daniela that the animal's welfare is paramount, that your photo is not worth causing the disruption that will cause an animal to maybe walk away from feeding, or not mate, or limit its ability to survive. Because particularly, as I mentioned earlier, in the Rockies especially, but really anywhere, like grizzly bears, for example, or black bears, these are animals that hibernate in winter. So it's really important that they put on enough fat so that they can sustain themselves and survive the difficult long winters. So I think that's something that just has to be on the mind of photographers, that your presence is causing a disruption in some way. Whether you know it or not, sometimes your presence alone will cause a disruption in a bird flying away or something, changing its behavior slightly. But the number one tip I would say is just being mindful and trying to reduce your impact as much as possible. It's very difficult to do that if, number one, you're not being mindful of that, right? Intentional or otherwise. I think you just have to go into it, just being mindful. And then there's definitely certain things that can help. Telephoto lenses definitely help you get that distance. So this picture of a wolf, for example, was traveling with another gray wolf through Banff National Park. And these wolves were just there are lots of elk around in that area, and they're constantly just hunting and keeping an eye open for the prey in the area. So with a 500mm lens, I was able to get a close-up image, especially you're cropping after the fact. So sometimes the images can kind of make you feel like you're standing like 5 feet away from a wildlife. But I would say just being mindful of the distance and using things like telephoto lenses, and just being mindful overall of your impact, because even with a telephoto lens, a wild animal may not want your presence there. And if you're paying attention to the signs of distress, you'll be able to adjust and walk away, or give the animal even more space.
That's great points. And I'm gonna try to get to Audun here. We got roughly, I think, 3 or 4 minutes left of discussion. Then we want to maybe just answer a question that's come up on live. But Audun, you're a little bit different than Abdulla and Daniela, the fact that you're a biologist and scientist that researches some of these species. And I'm just curious as to sort of the caution that you might want to apply to the distance that you apply to your photography in the animal, because I wouldn't want people to embark upon the things that you do without some abundance, not only abundance of caution, but the requirement of sort of experience to allow you to get yourself that close. And what's the benefit of someone like yourself getting close versus, say, an amateur?
Well, it's definitely has its benefits. Knowing a lot more of the behavior of the animals and how you can, interpret that, see if it show that it's not comfortable with the situation or it's interested in you. And I think Abdulla and Daniela also touch into it, in an ethical way. I often go as close to the animals. Sometimes I'm there with my camera. Often I'm just a camera. We have camera traps. But I think the thing is, if you want to get a good picture of an animal, you have to behave. You have to get the animal to get used to it, to accept you in a way. If you try to chase it, it will always go away. You will never get the picture you want, and you will see it on the picture. But if you get their trust, use time, get them to trust you. Sometimes they get curious. I've had that with whales. They come into you. But particularly, that's something I try to say because there's a lot of whales up here in the north now, and I know Daniela was there recently and tourism. But it's sometimes it seems like it's a little competition. They want to get as close as possible to the whales, but the whales move away. And the thing is, if you get their trust, they sometimes will come to you and they seek you, and that's when you get your good pictures. So you have to behave in order to get some really, really good pictures. And of course, for me as a scientist, also, I know a few tricks to sometimes get close to them without disturbing them in a way. So, but also when you sit in juries, you see images that are close, but you can see the animal is uncomfortable, and then you usually kick out that pictures.
Got it.
Those pictures. Yeah.
Okay, so that's all really good points. I think if people were to walk away from the conversation, those are really good points to kind of build by and have a sort of an ethical backbone to how you can start your practice. We do have a question, and I think it might be something worth bringing up because it deals with equipment. Someone, I think it's Sharon, who has a question about the way in which you do the half camera shot, half water shots, Audun. It's more or less like, how would you equip yourself to do such a shot? I think in the video it showed a little bit of what you use, but maybe just explain quickly about what kind of equipment is required to do so.
Yeah, I see the question. I could have a 2 hours lecture about that. It's
Oh,
a little about physics, and you know, you can buy cameras that do that, like with big domes and so on, to that are made for taking split pictures. But then you also need to know the physics behind it, because it is sometimes changed that the sharpness of or the depth of field will be different above and below surface, and so on. And the thing is that on this occasion, this picture you see here is taken during the polar night. There is no sun up. So in these low light conditions, it is extremely difficult to take this picture, to get things sharp both below and above surface. And the reason for it is that when you have this dome in the front, which you usually use, it creates a different sharpness below and above. So you have to compensate that with a very narrow aperture to get the depth of field. But when there's low light condition, you can't do that. It's impossible, because either you will have the above sharp and unsharp below, and vice versa. So what I had to do, I had to think totally different, and I tried out different things. So I ended up with having a big dome, which you saw in the video, which is flat. And if you have a flat screen, it makes everything the same. You have the same depth of field above and below surface. So you could take those pictures and getting things sharp on both sides of the waterline, and still have a quite open aperture. The drawback is that, of course, everything, the water magnified everything, so everything below water will then will be the 25% larger. Also, as a drawback in low light condition is that the relative difference in light difference above and below is much higher. So I also have to put on, I don't know if you saw that on the film, but I also have to put on graduated filters to compensate those, because the dynamic of the camera isn't good enough still to cope with it. So there's a lot of things that I could probably have two more hours explaining the physics. But
well, it gives us a sense, because I think, like, even when we talked about artists and so on, there's a mastering of what you do, and it's through trial and error, experience, using your camera, getting used to your gear. And it's funny because, you know, as you start to know your camera, you can push the limits. And I think this is where you start getting into equipment that allows you to push the limits and beyond, in a lot of ways, the camera, by creating a special housing. But if we were to kind of dial it back, I know, Daniela, you got your camera there in the screen, I can see, with a telephoto lens, I think that is. I think it would be interesting. We're going from something that's really quite custom, but maybe just introducing to people that may not be aware what we're talking about, that I think Abdulla even brought up, was the telephoto lens. He had spoke about a 500 millimeter or something like that. Like, what is it that is, you know, you're using to kind of get that distance shot, and maybe even holding it up just to give a sense of what people might want to know what one might look like?
Yeah, so this is like the cheapest telephoto I think you can buy for the Sony full frame cameras. I did use it to shoot these penguins. But there's also a significant crop. So this only reaches 500, goes from 150 to 500. I'll just extend it so you can see how far. Oh, it's locked. I locked it. So the reason I went with this one is A, because it was a lot cheaper than, you know, the Sony equivalent, and B, because it was a lot smaller. And because I travel solo, I try to get everything in a backpack. The other lens just would not have fit. I also travel with more than one lens. So, but even at 500, you know, this was at 500, but it was a Tierra del Fuego, also in southern Chile. And they were so far away, and it was just such a windy day. It was hard to keep anything steady. But even, you know, to get this sort of exact framing, I had to crop quite significantly. And so a lot of it, you know, is telephoto versus wide, but also the resolution that your camera can shoot at. So mine has a 40 megapixel sensor, which means that I could crop in significantly and still have, you know, decent quality. It's obviously not as crisp as it would be if, you know, maybe I had an 800 millimeter lens and I didn't have to crop as much. But it's tough. I mean, gear is very expensive, so you just you get what you can and you figure out solutions.
And when you're using a telephoto lens, is it something, and maybe Abdulla, you can get in on this because you're using on as well, is there a necessity, or do you find useful like tripods or something like that that helps kind of hold that lens steady and get your shot, or is it more handheld?
Yeah, so I definitely used a variety of lenses. My longest lens is a telephoto lens, 500 millimeter. It's a prime lens, so it doesn't have the versatility that Daniela was talking about to go from, I think you said 150 to 500. I used to have a lens that went from 200 to 500, but I elected to go with a 500 prime just because they're a little bit sharper. This one is pretty light. It's not an f4 lens, so you know the limitations there, of course, is with the light and the speed. But like Daniela mentioned, gear can be really expensive, and I try not to think about it as far as like I need the most expensive gear. I need an 800 or I need a 500 f4, 600 f4. I think you can get by with what you're looking with what you have a lot of times, or upgrade for a reasonable price. But yeah, the challenge with the bigger lenses and bigger glasses that tripods become more of a necessity, because hand holding a 600 lens or an 800 for a very long time just becomes a little bit challenging. And also you get a lot of shake, right? So that impacts your image. But I try to be as versatile as possible because I'm spending a lot of time on foot. So it's not always realistic to just set up a lens, set up the tripod and be able to take an image of a fleeting moment. So I have things with me that just kind of help me stabilize, even if I put the lens on the ground and just stabilize it that way. I try to do that as opposed to getting out a tripod and setting everything up. And sure, it's going to get me a sharper image, but I might also miss the moment, which is, in my view, far worse than getting an image that's potentially imperfect.
Yeah, so it's interesting that we talked about the idea of specialization. We have custom-made apparatuses, Audun's underwater camera. We have your kind of prime lens that is of large focal length, which is a very specialized piece of equipment. And I think that I'm appreciative of Danielle bringing in what you call like your off-the-shelf, readily available zoom lens that is affordable, because I think I completely agree with you, is that content in many ways is more important than the absolute crispness of a hair that's on an animal. And it's something that I think people don't have to get discouraged trying to get into photography and feel like you have to reach for that big expensive piece of glass. You can make wonderful photographs from more of the economical variety of lenses and cameras. And the whole point is just to get out and explore, and I think hit on a lot of the topics that we did today, which is keeping us inspired. And also, I think I want to build on Abdulla's, as in terms of a quick moment, is about mental health and how, in some cases, photography, as we see ourselves as creatives, it finds a way as an outlet or as a means to kind of be present within the moment. And I think that if we were, again, not to focus so much on what gear we have, but setting ourselves out in nature with some kind of form of ability to capture what we're experiencing, but also just taking in some of the quietness, as well as just a one-to-one relationship with nature. So I'm really enjoying this range that we have through our panelists here in terms of the kind of perspectives that they're providing. But maybe, I'm not going to speak too much more about the mental health thing, but maybe is that something that you all three kind of share, is that photography is a means of which you can kind of satiate an internal kind of comfort or mental health perspective?
Yeah, I mean, on my end, you hit it right on the head that, yeah, spending time outdoors in nature can really be a self-care activity, which I definitely view it as that. because it helps me just kind of energize. I don't know if it's just my personality, just being an introvert, but I think it's really I've heard from people who are much more extroverted than I am,
Yes.
and they still find that wildlife or just spending time in nature, not necessarily with a camera, but just going out on a hike. It doesn't have to be somewhere, really far into the woods, but just even going out in a local park is something that's refreshing for people. So yeah, I definitely encourage people to reconnect with nature, and I hope that my work helps people kind of realize what's close to them. Even if you live in an urban setting, that you don't have to travel to really exotic locations to have access to nature. More often than not, I think there is a lot more things that are accessible around us.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry. I wish I could carry on to both Danielle and Audun. I think we're running out of time here, but we've covered a lot of range in the topics. We're getting a lot of viewer responses sharing the same kind of sentiment in a lot of ways with the mental health perspective and the use of wildlife photography. But I think we have to conclude this conversation. Unfortunately, I'd love to have another hour with you guys, but I want to thank you all for joining us today. And thank you to Audun, Abdulla, and Daniela for sharing their photography and experiences. Wildlife Photography of the Year is open until April 23rd, 2023, and we hope you all have the opportunity to visit us in person. We hope to see you again soon at one of our upcoming programs. More information on in-person and digital programs can be found at rom.on.ca, and have a good afternoon. Thank you very much.